Anyway, so I want to, in that regard, want to go ahead and welcome Jason Altieri. Colonel retired Jason Altieri, U.S. Army, began his military service in 1984 as an enlisted soldier in the 101st Airborne Air Assault Division and served for 33 years before retiring as the Chief of Staff of the Army's Chair, National War College, Fort Leslie J. McNair, Washington, D.C. He is a graduate of Norwich University and the U.S. Air Force's Air Command and Staff College, School of Advanced Air and Space Studies, and the U.S. Army War College. Jason has been a contributing author to several aerospace and military history publications and published his most recent book, A Guest of Mr. Lincoln, The Wartime Service of Sergeant Joseph W. Wheelis, 32nd North Carolina Regiment, Confederate States Army, which was published in 2024. Future World War I articles, illustrated articles, will discuss the early acoustic warning systems and Luftschiffs and a whole list of ships that I'm not going to try to pronounce in German of the Great War. And he currently serves as an assistant professor of leadership at the Air War College, Maxwell Air Force Base, Alabama. Thank you for attending and hope you just enjoy the show of our hometown.
Well, I welcome him in every possible way. He's going to discuss the monuments in the state of Alabama. You know that almost every state in the Union has a monument to World War One, but this one in particular is his of special interest, and I'd like to hear and see what has encouraged him to cover this area and this subject. So, Jason, welcome to the program.
1 second. I just realized. Wait, there we go.
There we go.
Okay.
Good afternoon, ladies, or good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon if you're on the East Coast. Shelley, give me a thumbs up. Am I coming across clearly?
You are.
Perfect. All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, first, thank you for allowing me to speak this morning. The topic is, as you can see on the screen here, is we're going to talk about sending in the Alabamians, Montgomery, Alabama's monuments to Alabama World War I soldiers. Before I came on before I got on here, Sal was asking me what got me interested in this particular topic. I won't bore you with the details other than one particular story, which I think is relevant to this particular topic today. It had to do with the time Shelley and I were posted in Belgium when I worked at NATO headquarters back in the early mid-teens. And one day I took our children down to a playground in the commune of Steerbeek, which is a little neighborhood outside of downtown Brussels. And as our children were playing on the slides and the playground there, I happened to glance over and see a World War I monument to Belgian soldiers. It's a beautiful monument. The soldier was dressed in the typical fashion of the time with the Adrian helmet, carrying a Mauser rifle, wearing the long coat and the puttees. And as I was reading the names on the monument, it struck me that all of the men on that monument who had died came from that town. And a few minutes later, I was playing with my kids again and realized there was not just a plaque on the front of the monument with the names of the dead, but there was also a plaque on the backside that was a memorial to the men from that commune who had died in World War II. And as I read the names closely, I realized that the names on the plaque from the dead of World War II were the sons and nephews and relations to the men who had died in World War I. And for better or for worse, we live in an age now where statues and monuments to our war dead, regardless of which side they served on, now tend to serve as a whiteboard for graffiti, for artifacts. Some are even torn down. And that does a great disservice to those soldiers, men and women, who served. And from my own professional background as a historian and as a soldier, that troubles me greatly. And as we move farther and farther away from the generations that served in the First World War and other wars, it's important that we continue to have these discussions about these monuments. So we're going to talk about these Alabama monuments in Montgomery. And Montgomery, Alabama is a very unique city. Not only is it the cradle of the Confederate States of America, the capital of the state of Alabama served as the first provisional capital of the Confederacy. You can see statues to Confederate war dead. There's a statue of Jefferson Davis in the front of the Capitol itself. I myself serve as a docent for the first White House of the Confederacy. But you also have the monuments to the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Marchers. So Montgomery is at that confluence of many great historical events in the United States. But one of those events that tends to get overlooked, even in the city of Montgomery, unfortunately, tends to be Alabama's involvement in the participation of the First World War. And that participation in the Great War in many ways reflects Alabama's pre-war culture, economies, society, gender and racial relations, and politics. The mobilization of the U.S. military and of the American society in 1917 generated a great frenzy of activity and unfortunately engendered few permanent changes other than acting as a catalyst for what is known as the Great Migration, which we'll talk about here in a moment. From its beginnings in World War in 1914, the European War created a great many problems for the state of Alabama, as particularly financially. Trade disruptions began in 1915, and America's rapidly expanding efforts to supply the Allied war effort, Britain and France in particular, affected Alabama's economy to a degree that it caused a great deal of financial disruption to the state. Even when the United States declared war in 1917, there were still challenges economically, particularly in the cotton market, of which Alabama at the time depended a lot of its livelihood on. Cotton prices and production dropped quickly with the disruption in shipping, particularly in the overseas areas where industries in Europe were starting to gin up, both in the northern Midwestern United States, to help the war effort, not so much for women's clothing, so to speak, but for other goods. This change in the economy sparked what would become one of the first mass movements of African American labor in the South, which became known as the Great Migration. That was probably one of the bigger impacts that the war had on Alabama. In addition, about 86,000 Alabamians, both black and white, fought in the war, with about 2,500 dying in the effort. And we'll talk more about that as we get into the monuments. The thing about the First World War and the state of Alabama was that when the mobilization occurred, it also created some financial opportunities, not in manufacturing, but in societal and, quite frankly, cultural. With the mobilization, the United States began standing up about 32 military bases. Stood up about 3 military bases in the state. Two of the more famous ones, one being Camp McClellan, which would go on to eventually become known as Fort McClellan, which is a National Guard training center to this day. And the other one, which was the home to the 37th Buckeye Division, was known as Camp Sheridan. This certainly helped to the delight of many business owners in the local area, that about 36,000 soldiers would be training in the Montgomery area. In addition, there was also an Army airfield that was stood up, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But believe it or not, the war, when it came to Alabama, did not come as a result of the First World War, but it actually started in 1916 when Alabama National Guard units were stood up in the military effort, which became known as the Punitive Expedition against Francisco Pancho Villa's rebellion from October of 1916 till April of 1917. And many of those National Guard soldiers who had fought in the Punitive Expedition against Pancho Villa would actually come back and be mobilized to serve in the First World War. I mentioned Camp Sheridan, Alabama. So this was a training camp that was set up about 3 miles outside of the city of Montgomery on the north side of the Alabama River. It was situated on about 4,000 acres of land on what today is known as Lower Wetumpka Road. And in fact, that road still exists. It was one of several camps that was established. Uh, for those of you who have a Civil War background, yes, the camp was named after Phil Sheridan, a Union cavalry commander during the Civil War. The units that came through that camp were the Ohio 37th Infantry, known as the Buckeye Division, and they served there from August of and October of 1917, and then they embarked to France in 1918. Behind them came the 9th Infantry Division, which replaced the 37th, and that unit mustered out in July of 1918. Now, Camp Sheridan doesn't exist anymore in what we would have known it as a military base. In the slide up there, you can see what a picture of it looked like at the time. It had basically the cardboard type or plywood type structures that were set up. It was a temporary installation. It would eventually be torn down. The area today, when you travel to see it, is actually an industrial area and a housing, and basically a housing area. You'll see a lot of homes, none of them, which by the way, were of the period. All the homes that were built after the war. However, there are markers that still highlight where Camp Sheridan was from 1917 to 1919. In the lower portion of the slide, you can actually see one of the granite monuments there. There are also two U.S. Army cannons, one of the period, the other of the Second World War period. And there are also two historical markers that outline the history of the Buckeye Division while it served there, as well as the 9th Infantry Division. As a side note, one of the markers also talks about the 9th Infantry Division service in World War II in Vietnam. So it really, the markers there do transcend the entire period of the war effort, of the United States war effort in the 20th century. But Camp Sheridan probably was the one that had the greatest impact on the city of Montgomery. And Camp Sheridan's also going to have another impact, which I'll talk about at the last part of this discussion. But Camp Sheridan wasn't the only military installation there. During the war in the summer of 1917, the Army opened what was known as Keaton Station. It was a remount depot where horses and mules were bought for Camp Sheridan's 37th Division. And despite the fact that as early as 1916, during the punitive expedition to Mexico, the U.S. Army was starting to adopt motor transport, a typical U.S. Army division needed about 4,000 horses and about 2,700 mules as draft animals, as riding animals for officers and NCOs, and as pack animals to pull the 40 wagon trains, guns, and field ambulances that supported the typical U.S. Army division of the time. This is important for the state of Alabama because at the time, the impact of needing horses for the Army would have an impact on the local agricultural community here in the Montgomery and Lower Alabama area. If you're familiar with Alabama, the northern part of the state tends to be more industrial. After the Civil War, Alabama's steel and metal industry took off, while in the southern part of Alabama, south of Birmingham, it was still predominantly agricultural, and cotton and tobacco were still the key crops. And to plow a lot of those crops, you needed mules, and horses were still an important part of that. The Keystone Station occupied about 160 acres alongside an area at the time was a terminus for the Central of Georgia Railroad. This actually was on the highest elevation within 20 miles of the city of Montgomery. The city of Montgomery was originally, its original nickname was known as the City of Seven Hills. When it was first founded in the early part of the 1800s, it was in a great location. It overlooked the Alabama River for trade. And at the time, in fact, when you travel to Montgomery today and go into the downtown part of the city, you still have to travel up a great many hills. Not much is left of the Keaton Station remount depot except for the markers. The marker you see in the lower and right part of the photograph. The area is very industrialized where you go where the station used to exist. And really the only legacy of the Keaton Station is this marker that talks about the station itself and what was the role of the remount depot during the war. Of course, there was another military installation that was stood up, and this actually had its legacy with the Wright brothers at the end of 1910. The Wright brothers elected to open one of the world's first flying schools here in Montgomery, Alabama, in the South. And at the time, the Wrights found some land to the west of Montgomery. It was all cotton fields along the river, and they bought that property. It was originally named Taylor Field, but after the war would eventually become known as Maxwell Field, or today we know it as Maxwell Air Force Base, where I work. When the Wright Flying School closed in May of 1910, the field later served as one of the as Army Air Service's repair depots. It was actually called an Ardmont. I found that interesting that they actually used those types of anacronyms even as early as the First World War. At that depot, and if you're not familiar with military aviation depots, what they do is repair aircraft, particularly aircraft that are crashed. And with a crashed aircraft, one of the first airplanes made in the area of Montgomery was built there in 1918. The repair activity lasted there until the end of the war. The land was leased by the U.S. Army during the war, and later the Army would purchase the land, which is known today as Maxwell Air Force Base, for about $34,000. With the post-war activity, the War Department would eventually close down the Ardmont facility. This had a significant impact on the civilian community, and as you can see there, unfortunately, the only monument to Taylor Field in that repair facility is actually a Wright Brothers Flying School memorial in downtown Montgomery near a park that actually talks about the flying school. For the U.S. Air Force, their history tends to pick up in the 1920s when Maxwell Field was reopened as part of the U.S. Army, as part of the U.S. Army Air Corps. So those markers, those monuments talk about military bases that existed in Alabama at the time. Let's talk about what happened after the war and the monuments. So in November 11th, 1918, as we know, the Allies and the Germans signed the Armistice Agreement, effectively ending the war, and America's participation in that only lasted for about 19 months if you don't include the occupation army in Germany. World War I left a mixed legacy in Alabama, although the mobilization had demonstrated the efficiency of an expanded federal government and had broken down many barriers for women and blacks participating in mainstream society. For example, the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, was one of the results of that. The monuments for the Great War became an important part of Alabama's history in recognizing the service of those men and women. One of the first monuments, one of the early monuments that was put up was the Alabama War Veterans Monument in Montgomery, Alabama. It's located up on North Jackson Street here in the city near the state capitol. The monument was originally designed to recognize the soldiers of the Great War, but over the years, that monument has also been retrofitted, if you will, to cover the service of Alabama colonial soldiers who had served in the American Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the war between the states, right up until the Vietnam War. The photographs you see of the monument probably don't do the monument justice. It's very impressive when you see it up close and personal. The state of Alabama has actually put money into rebuilding the monument. Since about the since about the last 10 years, the monument has been subject to a great deal of vandalism and destruction. The marker you see in the middle there is actually two soldiers of the Civil War the small obelisk there, there was actually a statue on top of it, as well as the other monuments to the other wars. A number of those statues were knocked down by vandals in 2020. The statues themselves that sat atop those monuments have been are being rebuilt, and they are currently stored at the base of the Alabama State Capitol. Another set of monuments to First World War soldiers can actually be found on the state capitol grounds. The first one I'll talk about is the Alabama Flame of Freedom, Flame of Freedom, which you see circled there on your slide. This honored Alabama World War I veterans. It was erected during the commemoration, well after the war, of the 50th anniversary of the American Legion. It has an eternal flame on it. And that monument recognizes all the soldiers from the state of Alabama, all the way back to the American Revolutionary War up to the global war on terrorism. The other monument is the War Memorial Flagpole. I've just circled both the flagpole and the plaque that sits at the bottom of it. This particular War Memorial Flagpole was dedicated in 6th April of 1918 after a parade through the city of downtown Montgomery of 30,000 Ohio troops who were getting ready to depart for the war effort. The flagpole, interestingly enough, was paid for by the contributions of Alabama school children. And quite frankly, that's not an unusual thing to see at this period. Even in Europe, school children were asked to raise monuments for soldiers of the Great War. So this tradition was basically just carried over on this side of the pond to the war effort. The other monument that sits on the state capitol grounds is the Gold Star Memorial. This is in memory to the World War I heroes who died during the war, and it was dedicated by an organization called the Montgomery Service Star Legion on 6th April 1921. The Service Star Legion recognized that a larger monument to those who had died in the war needed to be instituted. The monument itself consists of a star-shaped flower bed in front of the state capitol, just behind the War Memorial Flagpole. It's a beautiful monument when it's in bloom. When it's not, in the wintertime, unfortunately it's just a giant star that's outlined with topsoil. But what I found particularly interesting was the monument itself that talks about the star in the center actually resembles an old style tombstone from the 1800s. It's a little worn down now, but if you know what to look for this monument on the Capitol grounds, it's very impressive. The entire Capitol grounds is also surrounded by the flags of the 50 United States. That was put up in 1961 as an addition to this monument to recognize not only to recognize all 50 states, but to recognize all the soldiers of all 50 states who had served in the state of Alabama during all the wars. Probably one of the more impressive monuments you will find in downtown Montgomery is the Rainbow Soldier Monument in front of Union Station in Montgomery, Alabama. This was dedicated on the 28th of August in 1917. Side note here, yes, we do have a Union Station in Montgomery, Alabama. If you are not familiar with the concept of Union Stations, there are Union Stations all around the United States. Union Stations do not refer to the Union during the Civil War. What Union Stations refer to is the confluence of railroad terminuses coming together at train stations. Prior to the 20th century, different railroads had different train terminals in cities, but they all ended at the outskirts of the city. So if you wanted to take a train from, say, Atlanta, Georgia to Selma, Alabama, the train only took you as far as the east side of the city. You had to rent a carriage, a cart, or walk to the other side of the city to catch the train to go to Selma. And in the later part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, the railroads got together and figured that was very inefficient. So what many cities agreed to do was build a centralized train terminal known as a Union Station. And at the time, the city of Alabama had three railroads: the Georgia Central, the Louisville Northern, and the Gulf Mobile, Ohio, that all terminated in the city of Montgomery. Hence, how we got the Union Station. The Union Station was also significant in the First World War because of many of those 37,000 soldiers who departed to go over from the war effort from Camp Sherman passed through the Union Station there in Montgomery. Hence the reason the following two memorials were put up there. One of the Alabama regiments that served with this monument was the 167th United States Infantry Regiment, which was part of the Rainbow Division. And if you know your history, that division, one of its commanding officers was one Douglas MacArthur. This 167th Regiment served with the 84th Brigade and its sister regiment, the 168th, out of Ohio. They distinguished themselves in a number of campaigns. Saint Michel, for example, Campagna, the Meuse Argonne, and Côte de Chalon during a battle which Douglas MacArthur would write about the two battalions of the 167th Infantry Regiment and the 168th. They talked about their great courage, the severe losses they took at a place called Croix Rouge Farm, where basically the soldiers had to attack with bayonets. MacArthur's observations of the gallantry and courage of that regiment was one of the highlights of the Rainbow Division's history. The regiment suffered about 616 casualties during the war and more than 1,000 wounded. When the unit returned to Montgomery in 1919, the city of Alabama referred to the unit as the Immortals. If you know the story about the Gates of Fire and the Battle of Thermopylae, in military parlance, that's considered a high honor. And that regiment was welcomed by one of the largest crowds ever to assemble on the grounds of the state capitol in Montgomery. The monument itself is open to the public. It's probably one of the more impressive monuments you'll ever see, at least here in Alabama, to World War I soldiers. It's very striking, and quite frankly, it's very emotional. The second monument that also graces the front of the Union Station is the Return from Argonne Monument. This was dedicated in 1921. I mentioned the number of casualties from the Alabama's 167th who returned. This memorial was designed by James Butler, remembers the last battle of World War I of the Argonne. The return of the memorial itself honors all Alabamians who fought during the Great War. Also includes those soldiers from Alabama who served with the 31st Dixie Division. That was really a replacement division during the war, as well as the African American soldiers, mostly from Alabama, who served with the 366th, and they fought with the 92nd Division. And if you know the history of that division, it has a very colorful history in that for a great many period, for a long period, that unit was under French command. I'll go to the next slide, particularly on that topic. Not a monument so much, but the historical papers and archives that are located here in Montgomery, as well as the Music Hall of Fame up near Muscle Shoals, Alabama, honors Alabama native James Reese Europe. He was an accomplished orchestra conductor, band leader, and composer of popular songs. And his key claim to fame was that he was the one that brought jazz to Europe during the U.S. Army's deployment to Europe during the war. And this was instrumental in changing the culture both in Europe and the United States. He served with the brass band of the newly formed 15th Infantry Regiment and the New York Guard. I mentioned earlier that the units that were assigned, many of the black units that served with the U.S. Army, were integrated into the French Army because there was no place for black infantry regiments with the AEF. Europe, unfortunately, would not live past 1919. He was actually killed by a disgruntled soldier in his band but he is recognized in the Alabama Music Hall of Fame in 2003, and a number of his papers can be found at our state archives here in Montgomery. And of course, no story about World War I Montgomery can be left unsaid without talking about this young couple right here. July 1918, Zelda Sayre met an inspiring novelist named F. Scott Fitzgerald at the Montgomery Country Club at a barbecue. If you know the story of F. Scott Fitzgerald in the First World War, Genevieve King had rejected him. He was middle-class Minnesota. She was a socialite from Chicago, and because of Fitzgerald's lack of financial prospects, she broke up with him. Heartbroken, Fitzgerald will drop out of Princeton University, and he will volunteer to serve in the U.S. Army in World War I. There are some writings that state Fitzgerald actually joined the Army so he could get himself killed in France. He was that distraught. While awaiting deployment to the Western Front, he was stationed at Camp Sheridan, the aforementioned Camp Sheridan. And for a short while, though, he was signed up to Camp Mills, Long Island, and then eventually returned to Camp Sheridan. He never deployed to Europe, and we'll come back to that point here in a minute. During that time, he was down at Camp Sheridan here in Montgomery. He had this relationship with Zelda Sayre. Zelda Sayre, who eventually becomes Zelda Fitzgerald, she was from Old Money, Alabama. In fact, her great uncle was one Mr. William Sayre. He was the owner of the home that became the first White House of the Confederacy. So she was what we call down here a debutante. Scott and Zelda were engaged in 1918. I'm using the words here out of one of the references. He pursued her with sexual recklessness. You can be the interpreter of how that went. And they had a wonderful relationship, except for one little challenge. Like the aforementioned Miss King, when F. Scott Fitzgerald proposed to Zelda, she declined to marry him because he did not have any financial prospects. And after Fitzgerald left the Army in 1919, he published his first novel, This Side of Paradise, in 1920, and whereupon Zelda agreed to finally marry F. Scott Fitzgerald. Quite frankly, I have to question his taste in women, but it apparently worked for him. The reason I bring up his background and his relationship with Zelda, if you have had to read that tedious novel known as The Great Gatsby, which has been inflicted upon millions of American high school students. By the way, I happen to be a Hemingway fan. I'm a big fan of For Whom the Bell Tolls. There is some misconception that in the book, The Great Gatsby, Daisy is based on Zelda Fitzgerald. Daisy is not based on Zelda Fitzgerald. The story of The Great Gatsby story is actually F. Scott Fitzgerald's love for Genevieve King. So that's who the novel is based off of. But in the book, it also talks about Gatsby's World War I service, where there was some question as to whether or not he served in combat. So that's our F. Scott Fitzgerald story. And if you come to Montgomery and you want to see the home where F. Scott and Zelda lived after the war, the Fitzgerald home is open to the public in the Cloverdale district here of Montgomery, Alabama. And last but not least, because we are coming up at the top of 1 hour, if you're interested in knowing more about the history of Alabama in the First World War, I would recommend these four references. The first is Alabama Joins World War I Efforts by Kelly Kazek. He's done some great work on that, particularly with collecting archival photos of the war. In fact, some of the photos I've shared today are from his website. Alabama in the First World War from the United States World War I Centennial Commission. They have a great list of the history of Alabama and the war on that. A book I would recommend reading if you want to know more about the topic is Send the Alabamians by Nimrod T. Fraser. This book this book has an interesting provenance because one of Nimrod Fraser's one of his grandfathers actually his father actually served in the First World War as a colonel. And finally, Martin T. Olif's The Great War in the Heart of Dixie. Martin Olif, out of Troy University, has done done some really good work on collecting the social, economic, and cultural impacts of the war on the state of Alabama. And no talk today would be complete without me thanking my wife, Shelley, for putting together this presentation. I have to recognize her because I drag her everywhere to go take photographs and do research on monuments, battlefields, and forts. And Shelley, thank you for your help in putting this together. Team, I have gone exactly 45 minutes at this time. I will take questions from the audience.
All right. And that may be difficult since we're having the technical difficulties that we are having.
Well, we can try the chat if nothing
Yeah.
else.
If folks have questions, you can pop them right there in the chat, or sign language if someone is feeling good
Just,
about that.
Jason, just quick from me. When you were in NATO headquarters, did you know Marcus Klauber? He was a former German tank commander who was also in NATO. I think probably about the same time as you are. He's a good friend of Randy's.
Well, I hate to confess this. He probably was down at Mons. I don't know him, and he was
He was in
probably down
Lille.
at Mons. I worked up at the political headquarters in Brussels, where I was sacrificing my liver for freedom in the West and the United States of America.
One question I did have for you is when they shipped out of Montgomery over to France, where did they go? Did they ship out of New Orleans, or is there a port in Alabama?
Great question on that. Most of them went up to depots up in New Jersey to ship out. That's a great question, though. Now that you've raised my interest, I'm going to have to find out the role of Mobile, Alabama during the war on that.
Because
But
I
most
mean,
of them, I believe, went up to New York, where they would ship out from there.
in my own research, 70% of the U.S. soldiers who went to France came out of Hoboken. So that would
Yes.
make sense.
And that also squares with the fact that F. Scott Fitzgerald was seconded temporarily up in New York for during that period. So that would actually explain maybe why he was up there for the time being, maybe as helping move soldiers overseas to Europe.
And were they only in the Rainbow Division, or were they in other divisions, the Alabamians?
No, they were primarily in most of the Alabama in fact, the regiments I mentioned were all in the Rainbow Division. By the way, Rainbow Division soldiers in the book Send the Alabamians, Nimrod actually writes about the reputation of Alabama soldiers. Apparently, they were great fighters on the battlefield, but apparently they were a handful in garrison and had a very bad reputation with the provost marshal.
They must have been friends with the Australians.
Go. I'm sorry?
They must have been friends with the Australians.
Yeah, very, very much so. Very much so. It's interesting you talk about that. If I can segue off that for just 1 second, there was a very interesting cultural dynamic that was going on here at the time. We talked a little bit about the black regiments that were serving and their hopes that they would eventually be integrated as full members of society. And unfortunately, that would not happen until after the Second World War. But what I did find interesting was this amalgamation of the history of grandfathers and even some fathers who were still old enough who had served in the Civil War, and now their sons were going off to fight in France under the American Army flag. And I came across some documents while I was doing research and was doing some online research. There was it was almost like a postcard, and it showed the Confederate battle flag with the song with the words Dixie being played on it, and then there was a smoke cloud in this drawing, and then the next picture was of the Alabama soldiers singing singing Johnny singing under the American flag, and the words "When Johnny Comes Marching Home." And why I found that interesting was that, like, you could make the argument that maybe this even happened during the Spanish American War. The Civil War and the Reconstruction animosity of "we're Southerners, we're not Americans" is starting to fade through time, and people are starting to see themselves again as being part of one nation. And I have seen some research that said both the Spanish American War and World War I helped end that animosity of Reconstruction and what had happened in the Civil War, and people started thinking of themselves again as American soldiers, not Southern soldiers. There's some arguments to be made against that, but I thought that was an interesting tell when I was doing some of the research on that.
As we was talking, I was just thinking of another issue. The officers in the Alabama regiment, did they come from West Point, VMI, through the ranks or whatever?
No, it's so interesting you say this. Prior to World War II, many of the land grant colleges were military schools.
Really?
Yes. So, for example, my father, who attended Virginia Tech, VPI, that was a military college. In fact, all of the land grant schools, and particularly in fact, to my knowledge, all of them required military ROTC training from the students for at least the first 2 years. So many of those commissioned officers were probably college graduates of those land grant schools, or maybe some lesser schools like the University of Alabama, but we don't need to go into that right now.
Oh,
Sal had
Sal,
a
you're
question.
muted.
Yeah.
Sal had a question.
Yeah, and he's muted. Let me or remind him to unmute.
Can't unmute. Oh, there I am.
There you go.
There you go.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Jason about the way the Alabamians conducted the draft and that the day in June of 1917. How did he go about that? How did they do that? Or do you have any information on that?
Sal, I have no information on that. What I do, so I can't answer that question directly. What I do know is that many of the soldiers who served in the war, many of them had already been members of the Alabama National Guard.
Okay.
And many of them had been mobilized, particularly in the South. Many of them had already been mobilized to serve in the Mexican expedition. But with specific details to the draft, I'm afraid I have very little knowledge on that.
Well, considering that Alabama was at that time more of an agricultural state rather than industrial, I just want to know how they went out to the farm countries and farm areas to round up the boys, because some states had terrible time with that, and others had a much smoother issue with that deal. Now, one of the things that I wanted to know is that I suspect the Alabama white population is more non-Germanic than, say, in states of others. Were there any of that animosity towards Germany, residents of any kind there?
Yeah, the only place that the biggest place that I know of that had a larger probably had a population of German citizens was probably in the port cities of like Mobile.
Yeah,
For the most part, I mean, Alabama is mostly Scots, Irish,
right.
English.
That's right.
You do see the ubiquitous postcards, advertisements, things about kicking the Kaiser, kicking the Germans.
Yeah.
But for given Alabama's demographics, I'm I haven't seen a lot. I have not seen a great deal down here referencing uh, the the biases that existed to the German population that you might find in other states.
All right. The other point is that you gave that example in Belgium of these fathers and their sons in World War II that were really, how about this in Alabama in World War II? Where did they, how did they show up compared to World War One?
As far as the monuments,
Well, not just monuments, just the number of them, because the state obviously grew in population after World War One. Now, I'd like to know how many of those that were sons and nephews of World War One.
oh yeah, great question. I do not have an answer for that one.
Okay,
I've never really looked that deep into the Second World War other than from an aviation perspective.
right, right, all right.
But I would suspect, particularly the Dixie division, some of the other divisions that were raised here in Alabama. Um, I would suspect there would be sons from those World War veterans who would have served.
Okay. When they were drafted and sent to Europe to fight, were they mixed with all other areas of the American Army?
Ah, I'm glad you brought that up. That's a great question to ask. So, for those of you who may not know this or not, prior to prior to the Second World War, Army divisions were raised geographically.
Okay.
I talked about the Dixie Division, the 38th Division, known as the Dixie Division. That's because they came mostly from Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi. The Blue Gray Division, the 29th Infantry Division out of Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. They were raised regionally. The 77th New York. The reason they call them the 77th New York is their patch had the Statue of Liberty on them, and they mostly came from that part of the United States. There was an exception to that rule, though. Over in Georgia, over at Camp Gordon, Georgia, a division, the 82nd Division, was being stood up and consisted of soldiers from, at the time, all 48 states. And when that division stood up, they adopted the moniker of which they still wear proudly today, the All-American Division.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
I heard of that. Yeah. And
so to answer your question, the regiments were raised by states. The states' regiments were then consolidated into brigades, and the brigades were consolidated into divisions that were formed usually regionally.
right.
World War II changed all that, obviously.
Yeah, it did. All right. Well, you're doing a great job of enlightening us about all this incredible monuments that there are in the capital of the state of Alabama. I mean, we could have 50 of these talks on this, but I'm very much thrilled that you did this in an area that most people wouldn't even pay attention to, or something about that. So, Jason, you did an excellent job, and I want to thank you personally for that. All right. I hope everybody else was impressed as I was. All right.
Absolutely. Do you want Jim to give a quick opening to what he's planning for October?
It would help a
A
great
little
deal.
tease? Okay.
Well, hello, everybody. I think everybody knows me. I've been a member of the association for several years, talked in the past. So the topic I'm going to talk about is U.S. women in World War I. I'm going to focus on nurses, war correspondents, and telephone operators. So as usual, I'll throw out a lot of statistics, who they were, a lot of personal stories, some of the key players. And actually, the war correspondence becomes particularly interesting because you get into the story of really the American Enlightenment and the development of literature in America. Women authors were part of that in the 19th century as well, and then became the correspondents. That becomes a very interesting story about that. And so I'll give a little bit of background. I'll try to keep the talk to 45 minutes and answer questions. And it's a very interesting topic, one that what led me to that is, I write World War I thrillers. And in one of my books, I have a telephone operator. They're known as Hello Girls. And so I'm now thinking of another novel, and I'm going to bring the war correspondent in. So my actual research feeds my literary work as well. So I think we can have fun. I think it's a good topic. And Sue, I've got a PowerPoint on that. I'll probably use it from my own, but maybe I can send you a copy just in case. Do you have the same email as Melanie had?
I do. Well, we use the Gmail, but yes, it should
Okay.
be the same. And I did put it in the chat.
Okay.
I'm
Oh,
looking
great. Thanks
forward
a
to
lot.
it, Jim. I really am looking forward to that because that is a topic that will always interest everybody.
Yeah, I think it's fun. So let me just go. Um,
Thank you.
All
so it's
right.
Sal's CL.
I can send, I'll email you with it.
Yeah, if you don't, that would be better for me.
Then you can
Thanks.
just respond to it. That'd be terrific.
All right. Thanks,
Great.
Sean.
Look forward
You're
to it,
doing a
everybody.
great job.
Yep. And well, we'll try to work out these technical difficulties, and there's always a kink somewhere, and we really appreciate your time,
Yeah,
Jason,
we do.
in coming and presenting on Montgomery.
Very good. Take care.
All right, thank you, everybody.